straightforward. And tonight's talk is about what is nature. And what is nature is something that has concerned humanity as long as humanity has been on planet Earth. And it's become slightly more formalized with the rise of the early civilizations, the Sumerians, the Egyptians. The ancient Chinese then had a much more thought-through idea of Taoism and the Tao, which is the way and living in accord with nature. The ancient Greeks also considered what nature is and what nature consisted in. The ancient Hindus also talked about physis, matter, and prakriti, energy, in terms of nature. And so it goes on. And some of the philosophers in the Western world, for example, Baruch Spinoza, went as far as saying that God is nature, or Deus sive natura. So there's obviously something very deep in our human psychological psyche that makes us ask this particular question. Not just what nature is, but also how we should live as part of nature. And I'm delighted that Stuart is with us today to give this talk, because he has got so much experience. And I just want to introduce him. And that is that he's the Emeritus Professor of Biology at the University of Bath, which he's now been associated with for almost 48 years. So a lifetime of association with the University of Bath. There can't be many who have spent as many years at the university. And while there, he was formerly head of what is now the Department of Life Sciences, and also served as the chair of the Natural Sciences Teaching Program, and was a member of both the university's Senate and Council. But for him, that was a distraction, and he actually just liked teaching and researching. He's a native of Bradford in Yorkshire, and he grew up playing on the beaches at Blackpool, now often touted as being the least economically successful place in the UK, but has a lovely sandy beach. He attended a grammar school there, which gave him the opportunity to be a thinker, which he continues to enjoy. He's a graduate of the University of Cambridge, where he also did his PhD. Before coming to Bath, he had research fellowships at the University of Bristol and the University of Washington, Seattle in the USA. He's interested in everything about living things and is a fellow of the Linnean Society, which celebrates the diversity of life. But he's also a specialist in the science of insects and was president of the Royal Entomological Society, of which he is now an honorary fellow. He is very keen to share his enthusiasm for science with everyone, and he's been an on and off convener at the BLSI Science Group for 15 years. Well, he's not just a convener for science still at the BLSI, he's also now the convener for sustainable environment, which is becoming more of a pressing issue, not just locally, but globally. As you will hear this evening, Stuart is very concerned about the future of our environment, and he's the founding convener of the BLSI Sustainability Group. He wants to make everyone aware of what needs to be done to protect the nature we live in and the planet we inhabit. Please put your hands together to welcome Stuart.
Thanks, Andreas. Good evening, everyone. So tonight I'm going to talk about how you and I and other people alive today think about the environment, and of course that suggests that it makes a difference how we act. Now, why is that not working?
The left-hand side of the touch pad.
Ah, yes. Here we go. Thank you. Right, so this talk's going to be in 3 unequal parts. First, I'm going to talk about the history of ideas about nature. And second, I'm going to talk about the Anthropocene Age and why and how nature is endangered. And then I'm going to talk about conservation and why and how nature can be protected. And Andreas talked a little bit about some far away ideas about how people have thought about nature. And I hope that broader-minded listeners online and here in the room will forgive me if my talk this evening is a bit European-centric, and my excuse is simply that I know more about it. But it is my belief that the historical succession of ideas about nature that I describe was probably followed in most other parts of the world too. So here's a picture of a lovely place. I've already been asked once this evening where it is. And Charles, it's Walden Pond. Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts is a place that's really famous to those who think about this subject. It's where, in a homemade cabin on the shores of the pond, Henry David Thoreau made his home from July the 4th in 1845 to September the 6th in 1847. And in his journal, he wrote about a spiritual journey into his own mental development that took place while he was staying there. And his goals were simple living and self-sufficiency, but he found that just doing that made a big difference to the way that he felt about himself. Basically, he felt that it was essential to live within nature in order to be able to understand oneself. It's actually extremely difficult to categorize Thoreau's philosophy. It's not exactly nature worship, but it certainly does recommend respecting nature for what it is. It's not exactly hardcore philosophy, but it's certainly inspirational. And the book that he wrote is actually one of the most reprinted of all American classics. It stands very close to Melville's Moby Dick in the American pantheon of literature. So that's where we're starting. Thoreau said we should think hard about nature, but what do we mean when we say nature? This photo shows a clearing in the Amazon rainforest with agricultural land being used to grow soybeans right next to a bit of uncleared forest. It's pretty obvious which of those two areas has the most nature in it. Rather obvious. But the methodology of science requires us to quantify even obvious ideas. So how do we quantify nature? At least a picture like this helps us to identify those characteristics that we use to distinguish between natural and unnatural. And in this case, for example, we could count the trees, we could measure how big they are, we can actually measure the energy flow through the landscape. And I'm going to be talking about this kind of stuff later on. And so on. But you must remember that when we use these scientific measurements, we're making value judgments about what to measure. So the aim of this part of the lecture is to look at how we as a global society think about the environment today. And Thoreau was a good place to start because that's what he tried to do too. But first, I think we'd better look at how people thought about this long ago in the past. We tend to think of our most remote ancestors who made their living long ago as hunter-gatherers as in some way primitive. But really, we should start with their opinions because they were professionals when it came to knowing all about the natural environment in which they lived. If they weren't experts in the subject, they would literally starve to death. Anthropological research has shown that present-day hunter-gatherers still practicing that way of life, and there aren't very many of them, but they all have animist beliefs. And what that means is that they thought that every aspect of nature was the home to spiritual but non-material entities who guarded its well-being. But with the invention of agriculture, a new way of thinking about nature arose. Most creation myths are actually derived from religions that arose at the same time as the origin of agriculture. And in those myths, a powerful god, not a man, is the creator. And this high god is portrayed as creating an ideal, ordered agricultural situation or garden for us, humans, to live in. Before that creation, all was chaos and disorder. The religion that probably most of us are most familiar with is part of the Abrahamic tradition, starting with Judaism. And we know all about the creation of Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden. But actually lots of other world religions also have similar ideas, and this accords with agriculture being part of the origin of humanity. And of course we now know that it wasn't the origin, there was something before that. But what happened next was that Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden because they didn't do what they were told. And they entered the disorder of the world outside, and their task was now to recreate the order of Eden. Most present day major religions have similar sorts of story. And there are thus two kinds of nature. There's cultivated nature, which is orderly and good. And outside it, there's a wild and disorderly nature, which is not good. In fact, it's threatening and dangerous. And in the myth, we humans all desire to return to God's highly modified version of nature. What was outside was unpleasant, where people wouldn't voluntarily go. And in this view, nature is actually not nice at all. So God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth." The idea was that the task, God-given task of people, was to recreate orderly nature out of disorderly nature. Now, this is really very interesting, isn't it? Because we don't really, we continue in this tradition, but actually our idea of nature now is really quite different from this. And I'm going to try and show you how we've got to where we are now from this position, which was the norm in the past. In medieval societies, ancient societies, before that, people had to live with farming. These were their daily tasks, creating order out of nature, and indeed performing rituals in order to keep nature at bay. This is an arch-druid saying some prayers so that things don't go wrong in the fields. And there's this very long period from the classical period, from say several thousand years before the current era, right up through into the medieval era, represented by Wells Cathedral, so close to here, where people were actually rather wary of wild nature. But then something remarkable happened. In 1492, Christopher Columbus got off his boat and landed in Hispaniola in the West Indies, and not knowing it, discovered a new world. Over the next few years, people realized that there were whole parts of the world where they didn't know about. The explorers and conquerors of those previously unknown parts of the world continued with the idea that nature is bad and must be subdued, and this conveniently included regarding the people who actually lived in that newly discovered world as being dispensable, and they proceeded to dispense with them. There was a massive die-off of people in the New World, so intense, in fact, that it caused reforestation of lots of previously discovered land in Mexico and in Western, South and Northern South America, sufficient, in fact, to soak up lots of CO2, cool the earth, and cause the cold period of the late medieval and early modern times. And the European colonists of the New World quickly had to invent a whole new way to think about nature. They pretended that the world that they'd recently conquered and appropriated for themselves had never had any human inhabitants other than themselves. And they reinforced this with art and literature that celebrated what they now called the wilderness, conveniently forgetting that this landscape had once belonged to different people who had now disappeared. The view of the unspoilt nature of the New World landscape still persists today in our way of thinking about nature, very much influenced by this New World view of nature. So the 18th century came along, and this was the age in which European empires grew quite remarkably. And now wild, undiscovered nature was seen as a treasure trove to be exploited. Nature may sometimes still have been frightening, but it was potentially profitable. And doctor naturalists like the Swedish naturalist Linnaeus, Carl Linnaeus, studied and classified this new wild nature, at least partly with an aim, the aim of bringing it into European domain and making money out of it. The British aristocrat and explorer Joseph Banks went out to collect it. He sailed all around the world, bringing it home for the museums that were beginning to accumulate it, and he corresponded with Linnaeus as to what it was that he'd discovered, but the attraction still was that wild nature was other, and it had to be brought home. In the mid-18th century, however, an intellectual movement was initiated that would have profound implications for human views about the environment, and it became known as the Romantic movement, and it early on diverged into two approaches that would perhaps be better described under different names. And the early proponents of Romanticism were mostly German. Prominent among them was the writer Johann Wilhelm Goethe, great hero of mine, and a real polymath. Goethe was very keen to consider everything in nature as constantly changing, and this was rather a novel idea. People before this had, all the way back through to Aristotle, had considered nature as being unchanging, and they just didn't recognize that this unchanging appearance was actually a dynamic equilibrium. And Goethe was one of the people who really made people realize this. And his mate, Alexander von Humboldt, was also a great innovator, and he was an explorer. He went out and spent a lot of time in South America, and then later travelled in Siberia. And he had the idea that nature was a magnificent system created by an all-powerful God, but in which everything fitted together. And he had this wonderful idea of everything being in its place in a wonderful system. So between the two of them, you have this idea arising of a dynamic system in which everything has its place. And this is something I'm going to come back and talk about later. But a totally different strand of Romanticism was meanwhile being pursued here by English writers like Wordsworth, who invented a whole new way of thinking about humanity as being inspired by the wild places of nature. And he portrayed the magnificence of nature as an inspiration to piety. And this was immensely influential, and it led later writers all over Europe to regard the study of nature as being a branch of theology. And Wordsworth deserves credit with inspiring the huge public interest in natural history that characterized the Victorian age. But Victorian natural history wasn't always good, especially when it led collectors to collect too much. And another weird thing that happened at this time was that the idea that nature was a bit threatening began to come back. And you get people like Mary Shelley here noticing that the energy that's associated with life might be harnessed in difficult ways. And this led to ideas like the famous Frankenstein story. So where was God in all of this? The Georgians were rather forgetting about God. They weren't a very pious collection of people, although there were plenty of pious people still around. On the whole, Georgian culture wasn't like that. But towards the end of the Georgian period, theology started to fight back. And to the Georgian parson, William Paley, all of nature was evidence for the minute involvement of the hand of God in every detail of creation. For my part, he said, I take my stand in human anatomy. Elsewhere, he insists upon the necessity in each particular case of an intelligent, designing mind for the contriving and determining of the forms which organized bodies bear. And he constructed a particularly well-crafted argument on the idea that if one were to discover a watch lying on the ground, then you would naturally have to infer the existence of a watchmaker. And he took this position in arguing for the existence of God. Now, actually, Richard Dawkins was infuriated by this argument. He wrote a whole book trying to knock Paley off this theist perch. But it's very interesting that, in fact, Darwin himself had studied Paley in great detail as a student, and certainly as a young man, he was totally convinced by Paley's arguments that nature is indeed the creation of God. And he only lost that faith when he realized that actually Paley was wrong. So those are some ideas about nature that I think perhaps might start to explain to you where we've come from. And now we have to talk about ideas about nature that are still current and inform our own way of thinking about it. And one of these very important ideas goes back to this man, Thomas Robert Malthus, who actually lived in Bath for some time. And he conceived the idea that there were limits to the human exploitation of nature. In other words, that nature was not completely self-contained and resilient and could be pushed too far. And he said, the germs of existence contained in this spot of earth with ample food and ample room to expand in would fill millions of worlds in the course of a few thousand of years. Necessity, that imperious all-pervading law of nature, restrains them within the prescribed bounds. Our modern way of thinking about this is that if you were to have a test tube and put a few yeast cells in a nutrient medium in it, those cells would reproduce themselves exponentially, and eventually they would simply run out of nutrients and would have to reach some kind of ceiling on their growth. This is what we now call the carrying capacity, K. And this is an idea that informed really the whole of Darwin's thinking. Having read Malthus's book about the control of population size, he realized that ultimately living things must all compete with each other within nature. And this idea has become really all important, I think, in our current views of the way that nature works. And it reached a zenith in the 1960s and 70s with the first report of the Club of Rome, a book called The Limits of Growth. The Club of Rome is a think tank, that's to say it's a talking shop that publishes its ideas, and it arose initially in the 1960s from a group of concerned politicians and international bureaucrats, and then recruited a team of largely American academic researchers, notably Jay Forrest and Dennis and Donella Meadows. And some of those were ecologists, some of them were economists, and they all had the same idea as Malthus and Darwin, which is that nature is a system with many components which all have to share a limited pool of materials and energy, and that if the system gets too complex, it's at risk of crashing and using up all the resources. Population growth would peak and then crash. Pollution would rise and then crash. Food would also crash. And the Club of Rome's report, The Limits to Growth, became a bestseller in the early 70s, and it still is behind, I think, a lot of political thinking about ecology and the way that the world works. And I guess that there's an awful lot about it that you can't really argue with. There is no doubt that nature is subject to limits. It simply cannot occupy more and more space because there is not more and more space for it to occupy. And the trouble is that it is becoming evident that the basic postulate of the Club of Rome's Limits to Growth report is correct, and that human impact on the planet has grown and grown ever since then, to the point that actually the impact of man will be detectable to the geologists of the future. We have all of these piles of rock strata underneath our feet, representing different ages of geological history, and each boundary between each period, in fact, represents a crash in the Earth system when the system became unsustainable. And here we are now with a remarkable influence on the Earth environment. We are changing the composition of the atmosphere, changing the Earth's climate, changing the deposition of rocks, and using up materials in ways that were never before imagined. This idea of the Anthropocene Age was one that was invented by this man, Paul Crutzen, who he's a Dutch Nobel laureate. He's an atmospheric chemist, and he was particularly interested in human effects on the atmosphere. But he also concluded that human impact on the Earth environment was now so great and so pervasive that we were entering a new geological age. And of course, one of the main reasons that the impact of humanity on the planet is so great is that the population of humans has exploded. If we go, oh dear, here we go. If we go back to the time that I started to talk about with the invention of agriculture, the population of the planet was perhaps a few million at the most. And for many years, it remained very low, but constantly increasing, more or less, as Malthus had predicted it would, in an exponential way. But the thing about exponential equations is that the rate of increase just gets faster and faster and faster. And here we are. This is where we are now. The United Nations Population Division is provided with excellent information on the human population of the planet. Governments everywhere take great care to document every birth and death because it's taxes. And so we can do mathematical equations which can enable us to predict with great confidence what the population will do. And in fact, what's happened is that it's only very recently that the rate of increase of the human population has started to fall off. And the prediction is that the population will stabilize somewhere between 10 and 11 billion people on the planet by the end of this century. Well, I mean, there's a lot that could happen between now and then. These figures are very similar to many other projections. Basically, they believe that the population will stabilize, but it's dependent on the collective decisions of billions of potential parents. But the thing is that we are now so much more numerous than we were before that we, in fact, now control the Earth nature system. If you look at what's happening on the surface of the land, if you launch a satellite to take pictures of what's happening, you can categorize what's happening very accurately. And of the habitable land on the surface of the Earth, 45% of the habitable land is used for agriculture. That's almost half. Remember that it's almost half, because I'm going to say something more about half later on. The other half of the habitable land is not immune from humans. It's forests, many of which are managed for our benefit too. Of the agricultural land, look, this part, 80% is actually used for livestock. That's something else that we might think about later on. If we look at land use in the UK, about 70% of land area is actually used for all kinds of agriculture. This is a map from the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology of land use varieties. The proportion of land used for agriculture is about as high as it gets anywhere in Europe. In the rest of Europe, actually only 38% of land area is used for agriculture, and that's because there are more mountains, more natural forests, and indeed other things that we can't turn into farms. If you look at global cropland, what you see is that this cropland is mostly in between 23.5 degrees to 66.5 degrees north or south of the equator. The tropics are not so much used for agriculture, but temperate regions, particularly in the northern hemisphere, very heavily devoted to agriculture. Incidentally, global warming in the future will almost certainly mean that this zone has to shift northwards somewhat. No one ever talks about this in the newspapers or broadcast media, but you can be sure that the leaders of the world's powers are thinking about it a great deal, and doubtless it's one of the reasons that Donald Trump is making so much fuss about Canada and Newfoundland, and Greenland. Well, I explained to you that there are a lot more people than there used to be. I've explained to you that there's a lot of land devoted to farming. The increase in the number of people must surely mean that we have more farmland, and indeed that's the case. Here you can see this is the area of cropland, which has increased pretty much in parallel with the population. Not quite in parallel with the population, because actually the cropland productivity, NPP means the net primary productivity, and it's the amount of sunlight that's captured and turned into biological materials. So the productivity of farmland has actually risen too over the same period, but there are limits to the extent to which this can increase, and ultimately if the human population goes on increasing, it will be necessary for cropland area to increase too. And yet I've already told you that actually almost half of the available land, habitable land, is already used for cropland. So there's a bit of a problem there. Incidentally, the only place where the amount of cropland has been increasing is actually in South America. On all the other continents, actually, the amount of cropland has remained pretty much the same, and it's merely been due to increasing productivity. So, there's that picture again. Loss of nature, conversion of nature into cropland. Actually, this has been going on in a very big way during our lifetimes. Here we are in 1970, about when the report of the Club of Rome was published, and since then, the Living Planet Index, compiled by the World Wildlife Fund, or Worldwide Fund for Nature, has been steadily falling. That's because there's less room for nature in farmland than there is in wild nature. The 74% decline in what I'll call biodiversity, it's a bit more complicated than that. This Living Planet Index is actually quite a complicated thing to compile, It's a measure of diversity that's computed by summing and averaging expert reports on population sizes for a very large number of species of mammals, birds and reptiles. There are 35,000 different populations of 6,000 species. So it takes a lot of work to do this. And it's not perfect for a number of reasons. And among the most serious criticisms of the index are that the way that it's calculated has actually changed over time, with more and more of these populations being added, as is shown in these graphs here. More and more data being added in, and it's very tempting for the WWF actually to add in new cases where they know that there's a decline going on. And actually, equally obviously, they tend to forget about the cases where the decline stops happening, because it takes a lot of work to monitor biodiversity, and you don't bother to monitor it if it's not changing. So it's probable that the WWF Living Planet Index exaggerates things a bit. And this is a particularly damaging graph. It shows you that if you look at the data that is actually utilized, the Living Planet Index appears to be falling very fast, but they also have a lot of data which they don't utilize for calculating the index. And if you look at that, then nature is not declining. I think it's not really as bad as that looks, but you do have to take the Living Planet Index with a bit of a pinch of salt. But nevertheless, it is pretty clear that there is indeed a decline in what I'll call nature going on. And this varies region by region, and it's much worse in Latin America and the Caribbean and Africa than it is in the rest of the world. And this is actually fairly simple to understand, because actually nearly all of the biodiversity in the world is actually concentrated in the tropics. The three great areas that we need to worry about are South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. And it's also true that not all species are threatened. I told you that there are something like 6,000 species being monitored to produce the Living Planet Index, but actually the fall in diversity is nearly all due to the 356 most severe populations, most severely threatened populations. And if you take those out, actually the picture doesn't look nearly so bad. Now, this doesn't mean that everything is great. What it means is that for those 356 populations that are being monitored, actually it's simply terrible. These are cases where these animals are likely to go extinct. That's on a global scale. How about here? I'm just going to talk about one particular case, which is farmland birds. And here, actually, it looks really bad. An index, rather like the Living Planet Index, can be compiled from observations of farmland birds in the UK. And since 1970, there's been a 60% decline in the population or the populations of farmland birds. Other bird species may decline as well, but they're not doing nearly so badly as the ones that live as specialists on farmland. And there's a very good reason why it's farmland birds that suffer, because it's actually the insects that are suffering on the farmland. And there have been many, many studies of insect declines. I've talked about this here at the BRLSI before, so I shan't go into it in very much detail, but this is one particularly well-known study which showed that there was a 70% decline in flying insect biomass in protected areas. These are wildlife reserves in Germany over a period of almost 30 years, 27 years actually. Now, the farmland birds include a very large number of bird species that are specialists in eating insects. So if the insects disappear, so will the birds. Well, is it really terrible? Maybe we could come back from all of this. Maybe we could institute conservation measures that would rescue all of this. The problem is that actually once a species is extinct, there's really not much you can do about it. Here's the dodo, went extinct. Last dodo recorded to have been seen was in 1662. That's about here. The number of species extinctions that were known to occur at that time was very, very small, and this is a graph of conservative estimates of the number of species extinctions that have taken place since then, and it's really rocketed since the 19th century, to the point that the background rate of extinction, which is obtained by projecting from the fossil record, is being exceeded by a factor of tens to hundreds of times. And this is very worrying. So, what's the problem? Why is all of this happening? Well, it's just because we take too much. There are so many of us. A remarkable piece of work was done by some Israeli scientists in 2018, and they put an awful lot of effort into estimating the biomass of all of the organisms that are alive on the planet today. And nearly all of the biomass is actually in the plants. This is quite appropriate because it's the plants that catch the sunlight and turn it into other stuff that other organisms can then eat or otherwise dispose of. We tend to think about nature in terms of just the animals, but look, these animals are only a tiny fraction of existing Earth biomass. And if you look at the animals, then actually most of the animal material is made of things that we tend not to think about at all. The arthropods, fish that live in the sea, mollusks, annelids, things like earthworms. Birds, I talked before about worrying about farmland birds, but look, these wild birds are a tiny fraction of extant biomass. Wild mammals are also a tiny fraction. Rather interestingly, there are quite a lot of mammals altogether, but nearly all of the mammals alive today on the planet are either humans or our livestock. Is it any surprise that nature is under pressure when we take it all? We're taking all of the space normally occupied by mammals and using it for our own purposes. Where is all that biomass? It's mostly on the land. Quite interestingly, there's rather little lives in the sea. Rather a surprise is that there's a lot of biomass in the form of microbes that live under the surface of the earth. We should think quite a bit about doing better at conserving those organisms because we don't really know what they do. This idea of conservation is the natural response to the kind of stuff I've been talking about. Where do those ideas come from? Well, he is one of the first people to think about conservation. This is John Evelyn, the diarist, a friend of the other diarist, Samuel Pepys. He was an early member of the Royal Society, and he was very interested in trees. He wanted to conserve oak trees because he thought that we needed to cut oak trees down and make ships out of them. And he figured that if we went on cutting down lots of trees for ships, eventually there wouldn't be any left. And he wrote a book about this, which was a bestseller. And so he's a very early conservationist. Another chap who came along about 100 years later, this chap Soame Jenyns. And he was the author of one of the first attempts at practical conservation, which was put into effect at Main Ridge in the island of Tobago, which is here in the West Indies. And he was a member of the Board of Trade, and he was able to cause an Act of Parliament which set aside high land in Tobago as woods for the protection of the rains. Jenyns didn't appear to have a theological or an emotional reason to make that proposal. He simply said that it was well known, since the writings of Virgil and Pliny, in fact, that deforestation led to the failure of the rains. And since Tobago was mostly made over to sugar plantations, it needed to rain a lot in order to make the sugarcane grow. This, of course, leads to the rather uncomfortable conclusion that Jenyns was probably a slave owner with an interest in making money out of sugar plantations in Tobago. But nevertheless, he did have the right idea, and he set aside this land, which is actually, to this day, wonderfully biodiverse. But this was an economic argument for conservation. But actually, people didn't start thinking about this systematically until this chap came along. George Marsh was an American polymath, a politician, a scholar, and a diplomat. And he wrote a book called Man and Nature, or Physical Geography as Modified by Human Action. And it was published in 1864. This is only 5 years after Darwin's great book about the origin of species. And it could be argued that it's actually been just as influential. And Marsh's book set out the observation that wherever you look, you see evidence that man in the past has damaged the environment, mostly through deforestation. And he said, whereas others think the earth made man, man in fact made the earth. And his idea was that it's we humans who make our living by altering the natural environment in such a way that we can make our own niche in it. I don't want to go into a lot of detail about this, but it's actually a very good example of what we now call niche construction. And it turns out that of all species on the earth, humans are the kings of niche construction. We live surrounded by the nature that we have made. And of course, this gives you some thought about what is it that we're conserving. Is it really wild nature that we're conserving? Because you could argue that actually there isn't any wild nature anywhere on the planet anymore. John Muir was the leader of the Victorian conservation movement, which mostly got going in North America. And it was he who was responsible for setting aside a number of areas, but first he started with the Yosemite National Park in California. And he said, this is wild nature, this is where God lives. This is the way that God created nature. God never made an ugly landscape. All that the sun shines on is beautiful, so long as it is wild. And Muir exemplified the archetype of our oneness with the earth. It was he who saved the American soul from total surrender to materialism, it's said. But actually, Muir was wrong in thinking that these areas in North America were places where man had never trod. He conveniently ignored the fact that actually Native Americans had lived there long before, and indeed many national parks in North America, they actually had to expel the Indian inhabitants in order to make them reserves. Nevertheless, it's actually Muir's vision of a theological justification of wild nature that is mostly the one that we have today. And we think of places like the Yosemite Park as being wonderful because they're wild. But actually, it is possible to think about it in terms of niche construction. Maybe we should conserve wild nature because it's good for us. Maybe it's in our interest. And another view of all of this is very much this one, which was promoted by this woman, Gretchen Daly, who is one of the most influential ecologists alive today. And she came up with the idea that one can value nature in terms of a capital resource on which we draw interest. There are all kinds of ecosystem services that are provided to us by nature. Aesthetics, it's true, is among them, but what about biodiversity? Perhaps that's good for us. Photosynthesis, forming the soil, providing us with food, keeping the water clean, fish that we can eat, wood that we can use to build our houses and furniture. What about pollination services to make our crops fertile? So all of this is valuable stuff to us. It is our niche to take advantage of these services, and the capital on which we are drawing is nature. People have gone to a lot of trouble to think about this, and essentially all of our human capital is really a subset of what is provided to us by natural capital. Human capital, that's to say, the training and knowledge that we have to undergo our ways of life, our built capital, the machines that we have, the houses that we live in, our social capital, our interactions which enable us to make a living. All of these would be valueless if we didn't have ecosystem services provided to enable us to live properly through natural capital. And it's a very complicated system, because if you look at these various kinds of ecosystem service, then they interact with our own human well-being in multiple ways. So it's a very complicated system, and various attempts have been made to put figures on all of this. I thought about providing you with a very complicated diagram that actually puts US dollar values on all of those ecosystem services. It's a horrific diagram, but actually I decided against it because another person who is very important in our understanding of nature is this man, E.O. Wilson, and he says that he really doesn't like this idea of nature being valued. And E.O. Wilson is in many ways the inheritor of that attitude that comes from Muir, a appreciating the God-given nature that we all love. And what E.O. Wilson says is that all humans have an innate bond with other species, and this arises from an inherited cognitive pattern that works best in a natural environment. We have a natural disposition to feel comfortable in the presence of nature. And he has an evolutionary argument to justify this. What Wilson says is that in those hunter-gatherer societies that I talked about right at the start of my lecture, our ancestors lived at very close quarters with nature, and they needed to know all about it, and this selected for biophilia. If you were a hunter-gatherer, you would simply do better if you knew all about nature. And what happened over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution was that those hunter-gatherers who had the best systems for understanding and feeling at home in nature were the most successful. And Wilson argued further that the human brain actually develops both through genetic programming, which is subject to this kind of evolution, and also by learning from shared experience. And he says that actually the human brain doesn't develop normally if it's deprived of the experience of nature. And that's really why we must work to conserve it. And, well, I don't know, that's maybe going a bit far, I thought, but actually a few years ago I got involved in a little bit of work which aimed to test this idea that actually humans experience enhanced well-being when they inhabit environments that are rich in nature. And together with some friends and colleagues of mine at the university, we looked at questionnaire data from all around the world on the sense of human well-being, which is, I guess, feeling comfortable in your own skin. David Cameron used to talk about it, didn't he? And what we tried to do was to correlate how comfortable people feel with the biodiversity in the places where they lived. It was a rather crude study because we had to study this at country level, and of course that is automatically going to ignore a lot of fine grain in the detail because there are cities and there are more natural places in every country. But nevertheless, there are some places like Ecuador, for example, which are universally acknowledged to be full of biodiversity, whereas there are plenty of other places like the United Kingdom, which are actually rather poor in biodiversity. And to our astonishment, we found that subjective health is indeed greater in those places where people have a lot of nature that they can experience. So here's Wilson's view of life, and he says, well, we should conserve nature because it's good for us. And he says, along with a lot of other people, we should conserve half of the space that's available for nature. But I told you before that actually we're already using half of nature for farming. And everybody agrees that although farms are splendid places, they're not the most biodiverse, they're not the most natural places. And this is a bit of a conundrum. How are we going to manage this? And I think I'm going to stop there, but I'm leaving you with a question which we're going to address at a future meeting of the BRLSI in about a month's time. It's not up on the website yet, but it will be very soon. and we're going to run a discussion panel workshop in which we look at how we can move towards a more sustainable way of conserving nature, how this will affect the allocation of land for farming, and indeed how that might have implications for what we eat and the way we live our lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Stuart, for an excellent exposition of nature, our impact on the planet and conservation. So I think we have been fed a lot of information, a lot of insight in terms of what has happened over thousands of years, and particularly what's happened in the last few thousand years, since we seem to multiply rather rapidly on this planet. We now come to the Q&A session, and Lynn has kindly agreed to do the Q&A in the room, while I'll do the Q&A online. We've already got some questions online, but we'll start, as always, in the room. We've got a dead stop at 9 o'clock, I'm afraid. So if I pass the microphone to you, Lynn, and then you can just go and take the questions.
Thank you very much. That was amazing. I've got a question about your opinion on the naming of the Anthropocene. I've read a lot of criticism about placing, obviously, anthro at the center of that new kind of epoch naming, and that a lot of the blame should be placed on the Romantics placing themselves at the center of a kind of natural experience. What's your take or opinion on that?
The trouble with the word Anthropocene is that it's been so amazingly successful so very quickly that the original definition of the term was very much in terms of physical change to the planet's systems and how this would have geological consequences. And in that sense, I think that the terminology was quite okay. It's simply recognizing that things are changing. And that's what geology does. Each rock stratum represents a period during which the Earth's systems are relatively stable, and then you get a sudden change, and you get different kinds of rocks being deposited in different places, and all of this is fine. However, very quickly, people who were not physical scientists took the term. They looked at this and thought, "Yay, that's exactly what we think too." And I do have a slide which I didn't show tonight, which shows you about 20 different book covers, all with the word Anthropocene in their title. And they range from books of poetry through to books of philosophy, education, everything. And I guess that it has rather degraded the usefulness of the word. I think one of the components of your question was that the word might be a bit dodgy because it puts humans at the center of everything. But I think that that is exactly what the word means. And the people who are keenest on using this word are in fact being rather critical of the fact that whether we like it or not, we humans have made ourselves the center of everything. We monopolize the flow of energy and materials through the Earth system. People call this human appropriation of natural systems. And it's true, we appropriate an awful lot. The current estimate is that human activities appropriate about a quarter of the energy that flows through the Earth's system. There is no other species alive that can match that, and indeed there never has been a species of organism that could do that. And it's very worrying because we're no longer confident in our ability to do it sustainably. And the trouble is, if you go to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, what do you find? You find our trash. We're not managing things well.
Stuart, there's another question related to this by Richard online. And his question is, the International Commission on Stratigraphy, the organization responsible for defining the geological timescale, rejected a formal proposal to designate the Anthropocene as a new epoch in 2024. What do you have to say to them?
This is a technical issue, and it's about an argument between classical stratigraphical geologists who are interested in layers of rock and other earth scientists who are more interested in flows of energy and materials. Paul Crutzen, who invented the term, is one of the latter. I think geologists, feel very much under pressure by what's now generally renamed the rest of the earth sciences community. The fact is that human beings are indeed changing the composition of the rocks that are being laid down. The problem is that the period that we're talking about has been so short that you can't go and look at a particular layer of rock that is already Anthropocene. But what you can do, for example, is to look at the bottom of a lake and see that the ratios of isotopes that are being deposited at the bottom of it are different to what they used to be. There's one particular set of people who think that the onset of the Anthropocene is very nicely marked by the era of nuclear bomb testing of the 1960s, because that's where plutonium first entered the geological record. I'm using the word in this lecture in a much looser way. What I'm saying is that actually our view of nature has to be influenced by the fact that we are now the most quantitatively important component of the biosphere. And actually that's rather a responsibility for us, isn't it?
Thank you. In your opinion, what do you think is the number of human beings that the planet can give a decent standard of living to?
Yeah, that's a very good question.
I'd like to ask how we're going to get there, but it's not time for that.
Yeah, it would be great to know how to solve the problem, wouldn't it? What people argue about what is the carrying capacity of the Earth. And the answer, I think, is really, it's a bit evasive. The carrying capacity of the Earth for humans depends on the way that we humans live. There's plenty of land available to grow food to support the present human population, and most people, for example in the FAO and the UN food programs, would argue that it could easily support the projected plateau population of 10 to 11 billion at the end of this century. But it would depend on us not eating a lot of meat. the production of meat is about 10 times less efficient a way of using the sun's energy than it is if you grow crops. So if you eat porridge as opposed to steaks, you can feed the planet with a lot more people on it. As it is, I think that we probably will run into the buffers quite soon. And at that point, we will have some very hard decisions to make about what we eat. And we will also have very hard decisions to make about how rich we allow some people to be when a lot of people are not able to manage. Is that a good answer to your question?
Yes, I mean, we've been talking about it for a long time, because I think how do you get people to not eat meat is a real problem.
Oh, okay, the microphone didn't quite get there, and the comeback is, how do you get people to alter the way they live? The answer is that I don't know. And a young friend of mine, I had a conversation with her about this, and she said a lot of young people feel very challenged by the fact that we don't have a good answer as to how humankind will work in the future, how humans will conserve the planet to continue in a livable state. And she talked about the increase in mental illness that we read a lot about in the newspapers and in social media and so on. And my answer to her was that, well, I don't know how we will solve this problem, but I do know that it could be solved, and I'm fairly confident that people, perhaps when their backs are against the wall, will figure out ways of solving it. I don't think that we're talking about some kind of Armageddon that destroys the whole of the biosphere. Either everything will fall apart and humans will be massively reduced in number, or alternatively, we'll find ways to live better and tread less heavily on the planet's surface.
Thanks. Ecosystem services. I'm quite interested in this concept, if only because it kind of hopefully helps us realize how reliant we are on nature for our survival. But for most ecosystem services, there isn't really a market yet. In many cases, it's still better to chop down a forest and sell the wood, and that's worth more than it is to protect it and benefit from the services it provides. So do you think that this is just down to the markets not being there yet? Or do you think that actually it's a bit of a red herring and we should be focusing on E.O. Wilson's approach and just value nature for its own sake?
How about both? I think that E.O. Wilson's biophilia idea, or John Muir's idea of natural theology, I think they're both very motivating for people to think about their behavior. I think that the real problem is that politicians, and indeed perhaps all of us, live our lives without a strategy for the future of the planet. The people who introduced the idea about natural capital did indeed have the idea that by introducing markets for ecosystem services, it would make it easier for politicians to make the right decisions. So far, that doesn't seem to work very well. By far, the most valuable ecosystem service we currently have to worry about is the maintenance of a favourable climate. And it's true that a lot of energy and ingenuity has already been put into providing sources of energy which don't pervert energy flow in the environment so as to cause climate change. And indeed, in this country, already a very sizable fraction of our energy is generated in a sustainable way. The problem is that actually fossil fuel use has continued to grow at the same time. And I guess that if you're talking about any one country, then it's possible for politicians to make top-down decisions and say, well, this is what we're going to do. They may have trouble justifying those decisions to the electorate in supposedly democratic countries, but even in totalitarian countries, actually despots never rule entirely independently. They always have to have at least some degree of acquiescence from the people who are ruled. So I don't think that top-down decisions are going to be very easy. And moreover, as long as we're talking about a situation where you have many different countries, none of which really want to be told what to do by the United Nations, the idea that top-down decisions would allow us to come to a natural equilibrium is pie in the sky. I just come back to what I said before. I don't know how we're going to do it, but I think that there will have to be some kind of change in the way that we think about nature. And, you know, the way in which we think nowadays, our philosophy of life, is more uniform over the whole planet than it has ever been in the past. And the idea that humans might agree to do things differently, I think is not totally ridiculous. I guess that what I think is that it's likely that such a decision might have to require evidence right in front of us that if we don't, we're in big trouble. And I don't know if you remember, there was a film on general release a few years back called yes, Don't Look Up. And you know, as the asteroid came closer, people did get very interested in doing things differently, but then it was too late. So we'll see. We'll see.
This is going to be the last question.
Thank you. That's a great honour. The energetics of this is very interesting. I'm thinking about the maximum use of available energy without detriment to the planet. One question I haven't thought about trying to work out, but somebody surely has. What effect does the atmospheric composition change have on the energetics of photosynthesis? I mean, the increase in carbon content of the atmosphere, does that have a positive effect on the energetics?
Yes, it does. I'm pretty sure that I'm right in saying this. Charles, sitting next to you, might have an opinion on the matter, but I think it's pretty generally agreed that when the carbon dioxide concentration goes up, actually you can get a greater net primary productivity in the same place under the same conditions, except for the atmospheric composition. So in principle, having more CO2 in the air could result in having more food available from the same amount of cultivated land, so that you could feed more people without needing to extensify farmland everywhere. The snag is that actually the increase in temperature that results from having more CO2 and the increasing instability of the weather that you get from things being hotter because you've got more energy in the atmosphere results in the tropics becoming less productive because actually they're too hot. Temperature over a lower range, life's processes simply go on a bit faster. But when you get up to levels of 40 degrees or so, actually life gets less efficient, not more. And I suspect that under global warming, we might see a decrease in the planet's total productivity because of that. Actually, from the point of view of the way that we will experience climate change, the biggest problem of the excess heating in the tropics will actually be that a lot of people who live there now will want to leave, because actually it's going to be too hot for people to live bearable lives, and the economies of those very hot nations may experience considerable disruption, and as a result we'll be in for a repeat of what happened after the end of the Roman Empire, when people moved around a lot and history got very interesting as a result. And I'm sure that the leaders of the world's great powers take this very much into their consideration about things. And for me, it's one of the strongest reasons why urgent action needs to be taken to restrain climate change, because actually it's going to lead to disorder.
Okay, unfortunately, we've not just reached the watershed moment here at 9 o'clock at the BLSI, but also obviously a watershed moment for the planet as a whole, for what Stuart has been talking to us about. So plenty of food for thought. And I suppose one of the things we should never forget, that as individuals, we can also do a lot to do our bit in terms of changing the values that we have and how we lead our own lives to make a difference. So can you please put your hands together for Stuart for an excellent presentation.